This is one of a series of Good Answers presentations, offering evidence to answer skeptical challenges to the Bible's accuracy. Central to that question, of course, is the Bible's record of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Well, Greek Christians are very definite about that. The traditional greeting the Greeks use on Easter morning is Christos anesti, Christ is risen. And the traditional reply, Alithos anesti, he is risen indeed. But let's ask, is Easter a fraud? Because Easter celebrates the resurrection of Jesus from the grave. And if that didn't happen, then Easter is a fraud. Come along with me for this time, and let's just see. At Jesus' trial, the Roman governor famously said, "What is truth?" That's still a good question. In the physical world, though, the answer is easy. Truth is what corresponds to reality, and we can bring out our instruments, run our tests, and we will know. The scientific method is our magic sword to separate the real thing from hokum. But what about the moral or spiritual world? Here is where religious systems compete for our acceptance. Here are the sayings of Confucius that guided Chinese society for 2,000 years. Here's the wisdom of Krishna, comfort to millions of Hindus for even longer. Here is the Eightfold Path of the Buddha, where nirvana beckons the faithful. Here is Judaism's crown jewel, the Ten Commandments. Here, too, are the 5 pillars of Islam, which Muhammad enjoined on all who acknowledge Allah. And here we find Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, the moral benchmark for Christians. At some time, however, the honest inquirer may ask, but which is right? And then the way grows murky. You can test Boyle's law of gases, or the acceleration of a falling body, but there seems to be no comparable approach for religious faith. Some speak of inner enlightenment, others of the ring of truth, still others of a changed life. Each, after all, is a set of moral and spiritual maxims to be accepted or rejected. A Hindu holy man may say, "It doesn't matter whether Krishna ever lived. What matters is the wisdom of his teachings." We must decide where, if anywhere, wisdom lies. In one form or another, it seems to come down to whatever resonates with you. Different strokes for different folks. If only there were a way to test the world's religions. For most, it's not a problem. The follower of one religion will generally admit, if grudgingly, that there are many ways to enlightenment and to what we call God. And after all, one cannot prove that one's faith is the only true path. But then, it seems, Christianity wants to stir the pot. As many know, Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." In a world full of sincere religious devotees, he insists on making an exclusive claim. The worship of Jesus is not just a way, it's the only way. Some nerve, right? But just as people begin to bristle at this, Jesus does something amazing, something unprecedented, something unknown among the world's faith systems. He says when challenged by the skeptics, some shake their heads at this, but others see that he is speaking of his own body. Challenged on another occasion, he offers what he calls the sign of Jonah. Jonah 3 days and nights in the belly of the great fish, himself 3 days and nights in the heart of the earth. What's going on here? Great religious teachers are Jesus has. He proposed, so to speak, the Easter test. That would be the stamp of authenticity for who and what he was. All right then, let's take up the challenge. Jesus has offered a test from the physical world, a question of an event in time and space and history, to verify his claim to be God's Son. How do we establish claims of fact in our society? Where else? In court. We have hundreds of years of experience in formulating rules and procedures to test claims of fact. Let's take this one to court. The facts to be established are beautifully simple. Did Jesus ever live? That is he a real historical figure? Then, did he really die? And finally, and most crucial, was he alive again after his death? The first of these questions is easy, and in fact, no well-informed person can really doubt it. That's because there is ample testimony from non-Christian sources to the fact that he lived when and where the Bible claims. Tacitus, one of the most admired historians of Rome, records, to dispel the rumor that Nero had burned Rome, Nero substituted as culprits and treated with the most extreme punishments some people, popularly known as Christians, whose disgraceful activities were notorious. The originator of that name, Christus, had been executed when Tiberius was emperor by order of the procurator Pontius Pilatus. That's the Annals 1544. Lucian, in the midst of satirizing a well-known character of his day, mentions Jesus in passing as, quote, the man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult into the world. From De Morte Peregrini. Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia early in the 2nd century, wrote to the Emperor Trajan for advice on how to judge Christians brought before him. He reported, quote, that on an appointed day they had been accustomed to meet before daybreak and to recite a hymn antiphonally to Christ as to a god. That's from his letter to Trajan, 1096. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing about events that occurred in his own lifetime, mentions Jesus, whom he apparently did not admire. Quote, now there arose about this time a source of further trouble in one Jesus, a wise man who performed surprising works, a teacher of men who gladly welcomed strange things. He led away many Jews and also many of the Gentiles. He was the so-called Christ. Antiquities 18:3-3. And then there is Thallus, a Greek historian, writing within 20 years of Jesus' death, who attempts to explain the earthquake and darkness that came on that day. A later historian quotes the passage, quote, on the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thallus, in the 3rd book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. This is Sextus Julius Africanus, quoting Thallus. Finally, we should mention Will Durant, perhaps the most renowned historian of our time. Though no Christian, nor even a particular friend of Christianity, he still acknowledges this. In the enthusiasm of its discoveries, the higher criticism has applied to the New Testament tests of authenticity so severe that by them 100 worthies, for example, Hammurabi, David, Socrates, would fade into legend. After 2 centuries of higher criticism, the outlines of the life, character, and teaching of Christ remain reasonably clear and constitute the most fascinating feature in the history of Western man. From The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, page 557. Was Jesus a real historical figure? Of course. Did Jesus die? We've already seen classical historians who attest to this, but we find the details in the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Tried and condemned by the apparently reluctant Roman procurator Pontius Pilate, he was crucified. To ensure death, the Romans normally broke the legs of the victim, so that, unable to press up and relieve the compression on the lungs, he would die in agony from suffocation. But finding Jesus already dead, they verified the fact with a spear thrust into his vitals. His body, embalmed by the women, was buried in a rock-cut tomb. And to ensure that there would be no further trouble, the tomb was sealed and a guard was set. So, did Jesus die? Pagan and Christian sources agree. He did, and any court would endorse the claim without hesitation. Now comes the crunch. How would a legal panel judge the claim of resurrection? What rules of evidence would apply? And would such evidence be available? First, as viewers of CSI, Bones, and so many other TV series know, there would be the question of forensic evidence. And here, there would be none. No body to autopsy, no crime scene to study. Next would be a question about documentary evidence. For a historical claim, documentation is the natural desideratum. Here we can say, yes, there are documents recording the resurrection. Then how about eyewitnesses? Here too is a potential yes. The documents refer to many eyewitnesses. But there's claiming and there's proving. Will the evidence meet the standards of a federal court? Anyone offering a document into evidence will first be asked, is it material to the case? That is, does it contain information relevant to the issue? Here the answer is obvious. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all contain accounts of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. They are clearly material to the question of his resurrection. Indeed, they are the earliest documents we know that bear on the question. So too, but in a less direct way, are the book of Acts attributed to Luke and the letters of Paul, Peter, and John. But the chief focus is the so-called Gospels, which claim to be historical accounts of the life of Christ. But no court would accept these writings without question. There would be demands that we show that they were written soon enough after the events to be reliable, that they were composed by competent authors, that the authors intended them to be formal records of the events, and, since the event was so long ago, that the documents have been preserved properly. At this point, a critical observer would raise an important question. These documents are not the originals, are they? Haven't the original writings of these 4 evangelists disappeared long since? Aren't we trying to introduce not just copies, but copies of copies? Yes, we are. But the law provides for such possibilities. According to Article 10, Rule 1004 of the Federal Rules of Evidence, in cases where the original document is lost or destroyed, other evidence of its contents is admissible. Ideally, a duplicate, which is equally admissible as the original under Rule 1003. And a duplicate is defined in Rule 1002 as, quote, a counterpart produced by the same impression as the original, or by other equivalent techniques which accurately reproduces the original." End quote. Here's the rub. The duplicate must accurately reproduce the original. Can we meet that test? I hold that we can, once we understand the nature of how ancient documents are preserved and how well one can trust the copies that have come down to us. As a classicist, I work with such ancient writings all the time. For example, Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. Written in the 5th century BC, his account of the Great War between Athens and Sparta is rightly called a classic, and he rightly judged the first scientific historian. Students read his work in universities everywhere. I have sometimes taught a group of University of Delaware study abroad students in Athens, where we read from his history. But the original copy of his history disappeared many centuries ago. What manuscript evidence do we have for him? In fact, we have 8 manuscript copies of his work, and the oldest is from about AD 900, almost 1400 years after his time. Or Julius Caesar, who wrote the account of his campaigns in Gaul in the mid-1st century BC. You can find several translations on Amazon.com. For his work, we possess 10 manuscript copies, and the oldest is from about 1,000 years after Caesar's death. Students of drama still read the tragedies of Aeschylus, the Greek playwright of 5th century Athens. I also directed students in reading and discussion of his Agamemnon in those same winter sessions in Athens. There are just 7 manuscripts of his plays, all from about 1400 years after his death, and for the first half of the Agamemnon, only 1. That's right, 1. Do any scholars, looking at the scanty manuscript evidence for these classical authors, express doubt about what they wrote? They do not. Even for the first half of the Agamemnon, which hangs by the thread of a single manuscript copy, I've never heard a classical scholar claim that we don't know the text of that play. There are discussions about a questionable phrase here and there, but the scholarly world recognizes that we have the works of Thucydides, Caesar, Aeschylus, and many others from antiquity in substantial integrity. How does our knowledge of the New Testament documents compare with these? Well, we now have well over 5,500 manuscript copies of all or parts of the New Testament, and the oldest of these dates to the early 4th century, just some 250 years after they were composed. And there are even some fragments on papyrus. It's nice and dry in Egypt, and this kind of material keeps turning up there. Fragments that date as early as the 2nd century. A.T. Robertson, one of the finest biblical scholars ever, wrote this nearly a century ago, quote, "There are some 8,000 manuscripts of the Latin Vulgate and at least 1,000 of the other early versions. Add to that over 4,000, now over 5,500, Greek manuscripts, and we have 13,000 manuscript copies of portions of the New Testament. Besides all this, much of the New Testament can be reproduced from the quotations of the early Christian writers." A chart may help to show how our manuscript evidence for the New Testament compares with other works of comparable age. Seen against a timeline, the works of Thucydides, Caesar, and Aeschylus depend on manuscript copies 1,000 years or more away from their authors, and pitifully few copies at that. The New Testament can boast thousands of manuscripts, with the oldest only 2.5 centuries from their authors. One of the oldest, Codex Sinaiticus, I've seen in its present home, the British Museum. Gorgeously written on vellum, It contains both the Greek translation of the Old Testament and the entire New Testament, and it's just over 2 centuries away from the original documents. What's that, you say? 250 years is still a long time? Right. But we can bridge that gap as well. Between the writers of the 4 Gospels and manuscripts like Codex Sinaiticus, we can find a whole series of names. Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Papias, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tatian, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Eusebius. Who were they? Early leaders of Christianity, who wrote on its behalf and, in so doing, quoted extensively from the New Testament writings. You may have noticed that Professor Robertson referred to these quotations. It has been estimated that if all our copies of the New Testament were to suddenly disappear, we could reconstruct it from these quotations and find missing only about 27 verses. They are then an independent train of evidence for the text of the New Testament from before our oldest manuscripts. Besides this, recall that as Christianity spread throughout the Roman world, it reached many people who were not educated enough to know Greek. So the missionaries translated their holy book into the languages of their hearers: Syriac, Coptic, Ethiopic, Latin. These early translations are a third independent witness to the New Testament text from that early period. And there is even one more piece. I said that there are papyrus fragments that clearly belong to New Testament documents, some of them very early indeed. One famous one is this, from the John Rylands collection, p. 52. It contains 3 verses from the 18th chapter of John's Gospel on this side, and 3 more on the reverse. It's dated to AD 138 at the latest. But if we take a deep breath, we can go earlier still. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are fragments from Cave 7 that preserve bits of Mark, in fact from 4 copies of that Gospel, plus Acts, Romans, 1 Timothy, 2 Peter, and James. Though not all these identifications are certain, for all of them to be found in one place and securely dated to no later than AD 68 is breathtaking evidence. Let's put all this manuscript business together. We start with the Greek originals of the New Testament documents. As they wear out, they're replaced by copies, then by more copies. Despite the extraordinary care of the copyists, some errors inevitably creep in. Textual critics, that's the name of scholars who specialize in this work, study the different manuscripts to determine the correct reading of any variant word or phrase. But this is not our only line of evidence. There are all those early Christian writers who quote from the New Testament. Their work provides evidence on how the text read at the time they saw it. But of course we don't have the original writings of these men, only copies, and errors can appear here too. So the same process applies. Textual critics study the manuscripts we have and arrive at a more accurate text. And then there is the third path: early translations from the Greek into Syriac, Coptic, and so on. By translating back into Greek from these, we can determine how the Greek text read when the translation was made. And as with the other manuscript lines, errors creep into the copies, and textual critics do their work to restore them. Finally, all 3 lines of evidence come together, so that we have the best evidence possible for what the original Greek was, and scholars then use that text as a basis for their translations into English and other languages. What's the bottom line here? We have by the judgment of every informed student, an accurate text based on the evidence of thousands of manuscripts and 3 independent lines of transmission. Professor Fenton John Anthony Hort's assessment is a classic one. He stated that the amount of the New Testament text which is subject to any real uncertainty, quote, can hardly form more than 1,000th part of the entire text, end quote. And that was over a century ago. We now have much more confirming evidence than he had to buoy our confidence in the accuracy of the text. But we still have questions before the New Testament documents could be accepted in a court. Next, are they authentic? That is, are the circumstances in which they were written and preserved what we would expect for an authentic document? For an ancient document, this is vital. If someone comes forward with a letter that they claim was written by Thomas Jefferson to John Adams, but that person is not a descendant of either of them and cannot explain how they came to be in possession of the letter, there would be a natural suspicion about the letter's authenticity. Here's the short checklist that the law provides for an ancient document's authenticity. Reading from the bottom up, is it more than 20 years old? No problem there. Has it been in the place where, if authentic, it would likely be? The documents have been in the custody of the church from the beginning. Obviously, that is the appropriate custodian. And third, are they in such condition as to create no suspicion concerning their authenticity? Now, here we may need another look. Specifically, we would need to know that the documents were written early enough to have been composed by the persons whose names they bear, for the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and early enough for their authors to have had proper knowledge of the subject they wrote about. And on that topic, there has been controversy for years. Ever since the 19th century, it has been the view of many liberal scholars that the Gospels and other New Testament writings were written late. Many said in the 2nd century A.D., 100 years or more after the events they recount. If so, then they could not have been written by their supposed authors, and whoever wrote them might well have been drawing on a long and muddled oral tradition. They would be unreliable. If you recall, Will Durant spoke rather disparagingly about the so-called higher critical school of biblical scholars. He obviously felt that they had used such overly demanding standards for the authenticity of the New Testament writings that similar standards would disqualify virtually all of ancient literature. He was not alone in this judgment, and over the past 100 years or so, further scholarly research and further discoveries of manuscripts, such as very early papyri, have forced liberal scholars to revise again and again their proposed dates for the New Testament writings. The dates have moved earlier and earlier, out of the 2nd century and into the 1st. Then, in 1976, something stunning occurred in this area of biblical scholarship. A respected liberal scholar named John T. Robinson published a book called Redating the New Testament. Meticulously researched and almost 400 pages long, it examined all our current evidence for the times when the New Testament books were written. It struck the scholarly world like a bombshell. His conclusion? All of the 27 books of the New Testament were composed not just in the 1st century A.D., but before A.D. 70. Here's a summary chart he offered. As you can see, the evidence convinced him that the 4 Gospels were in the process of composition in the late 30s and into the 40s, and in published form by the 50s or 60s at the latest. This means, of course, that their authors would have had access to many eyewitnesses, and most likely would have been the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that tradition says wrote them. If they were authored by others, the real disciples of those names would have still been alive to challenge the deception and correct it. What reaction did this new book receive? It has, to my knowledge, not been challenged with a serious publication by any respected scholar. Rather, the comment of Professor R.T. France seems to be typical. Quote, "It is probable that some, and perhaps all, of the Gospels were written in substantially their present form within 30 years of the events, and that much of the material was already collected and written a decade or two before that. If that is the case, we are not dealing with a long folk tradition, but with 4 parallel records of quite recent events, well within the lifetime of even a middle-aged witness of Jesus' ministry." End quote. There is, then, every reason to believe that the documents are exactly what they claim to be: accounts of Jesus' life by 2 of his apostles, Matthew and John, by the companion and assistant of Peter, Mark, and by the physician, Luke, all of whom were adults during Jesus' active ministry. There's still another question that a court would ask, however. Granted that the documents are authentic and written by persons contemporary with the events they record, were the authors themselves competent? Were they intelligent and skilled enough to have given us historically reliable information? Here we can look to what Luke the physician says in the opening sentences of his gospel account. Quote, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. Since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." End quote. That's what Luke had to say for himself. But what would a modern scholar say? Sir William Ramsay was one of the most careful and respected ancient historians of our time. He undertook a study of Luke's writings, the Gospel and Acts, with the assumption that Luke would prove unreliable. After years of research, here was his conclusion. Quote, "Luke is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, he is possessed of the true historic sense. In short, this author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians." End quote. What Sir William found to be true of Luke, most modern students have found true, in the main, of the other gospel writers. Scholars continue to quibble over minor details, but the general accuracy and reliability of the writings is well established. So, where are we? Would a modern court accept the gospel writings as valid evidence? Here's what we have seen. They comply with the material document rule. Their content is material to the question at issue. Though the original documents have perished, they meet the original document rule, on the ground that the thousands of duplicates we possess have been shown to be accurate by the work of countless textual critics, and it is clear that the original authors intended for duplicates to be made, so that the original information would be preserved and widely known. The ancient document rule is satisfied, since the documents are many centuries old and have always been in the proper custody, that is, of the Church. And also, modern scholarship has established that they were composed in the mid-1st century, well within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses to the events they record. and their general historical reliability is well established. Bottom line, the four Gospels are material, authentic, and historically reliable. The modern rules of evidence would require them to be admitted into a court proceeding as primary evidence. Now at last we can ask, what do they say about the question at issue, the resurrection of Jesus? It turns out that they record the experiences of many eyewitnesses to the fact that Jesus was alive after his death and burial. Mary Magdalene and other women came to the tomb early on Sunday and found it empty. They reported seeing an angel who told them Jesus had risen. Shortly after, Mary was confronted by a figure she assumed might be the gardener, but then he spoke her name, and she saw that it was Jesus. Two men who had known him were walking from Jerusalem to a nearby town when a stranger joined them. As they told of Jesus' execution and then rumors that he was alive, the stranger said these things had been prophesied, but they had not believed the Scriptures. Stopping for the night, they sat down to eat, and as they gave thanks, suddenly they realized the stranger was Jesus. The apostles had heard from some of the women who had visited the tomb, but they dismissed their report. Then, however, one evening, when they were together in a locked room, Jesus was suddenly among them. Frightened, they thought he was a ghost. But he spoke with them and showed them his wounds, and then as further proof, asked for and ate a piece of fish. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see, he said. On a second occasion, Jesus appeared to the apostles, this time with Thomas, who had not been present before. In fact, he had scoffed at their reports and said he would not believe unless he could touch the nail prints in Jesus' hands and the spear wound in his side. Then Jesus appeared and offered to let him do just that. He fell to his knees and cried, "My Lord and my God." Still later, in Galilee, 7 of the apostles were fishing from their boat and saw Jesus on the shore, inviting them to join him at a cook fire he had burning. They did so and spent some time with him in close association. We're told by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 that there was one occasion where Jesus met with over 500 people. He noted that many of them were still alive and presumably could be questioned. In this same passage, Paul also cites an appearance to Jesus' half-brother, James. Luke even tells us in the opening chapter of the book of Acts that Jesus appeared to various persons over a period of 40 days before, at last, he bid the apostles farewell and ascended to heaven as they watched. Finally, Luke tells us of how Saul, who later was called Paul, was on his way to Damascus in hostile pursuit of these new believers when Jesus appeared to him, shattering his whole world view and giving him a new one, an experience that Paul himself later confirmed in 1 Corinthians 15. These accounts of and by so many witnesses constitute a major block of evidence. If nothing happened after Jesus' death and burial, how are we to account for the separate experiences of so many people? Some were alone, others with a companion or a small group, others with a crowd of hundreds. He spoke with many. He denied that he was a ghost and proved it by eating in their presence. He displayed the wounds he had received on the cross, establishing that it was he and no look-alike. And the disciples who had deserted him, denied him, and after his death had been hiding behind locked doors, suddenly were transformed into bold witnesses, announcing to the world that Jesus was alive. Something had happened. Well, the witnesses have been admitted to court and have had their say. but we can't excuse them just yet. The opposition has the right to cross-examine their testimony. In fact, ever since the resurrection, there have been ones who denied its reality, and for the past couple of centuries especially, we have heard from the opposition. They have a right to question. Let's hear what they have to offer. Here's a very popular complaint. We have 4 major accounts of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, but they did. For example, in telling of the road, cheering and waving palm branches. But there's a discrepancy, we're told. Matthew says that the disciples fetched a donkey and its colt at Jesus' direction so that he could ride into the city, but the other accounts mention only the donkey. So the witnesses don't agree. And there are other things like this throughout the 4 Gospels. True, there are several examples like this that one can find. A sharp lawyer would point out these things, but a judge would not be impressed, nor would a sensible jury. Witnesses who all describe an event in precisely the same way are the ones who produce suspicion. They've been coached. But honest witnesses describing the same scene will testify to what they saw from their own perspectives, mentioning what they most noticed and what seemed most significant to them. Matthew presumably thought it was interesting that the disciples brought both the donkey and its colt, presumably for Jesus to choose which one to ride. The other writers, noting correctly that it was the donkey he rode, saw no reason to mention the other animal. That's not a contradiction. It's the mark of what real witnesses do when telling about something they have seen. Nobody challenges in this case that Jesus was brought a donkey, and that he rode it in a procession. The same is true of the resurrection accounts. One can get all exercised about how Luke tells about Jesus meeting 2 men on the road to Emmaus, while the other 3 authors don't. But this only shows that the accounts are independent, and none of them tries to tell of every. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. John 21:25. But as we all know, an opposing attorney will often resort to offering a different theory to counter what the witnesses have said. He will hope to create reasonable doubt about the truth of what's been said in evidence. Let's hear those theories. Here's one. Jesus didn't actually die at all. Weakened by the pain and loss of blood, he fainted and appeared dead. In that state, he was taken down from the cross and placed in the tomb. And there, in the cool and damp atmosphere, he revived. Escaping the tomb, he located his followers who tended his wounds and spread the story of his miraculous return. There are too many holes in a theory like this to even mention them all. Only one needs to be mentioned because it's decisive. Roman soldiers had performed thousands of crucifixions in these years. They knew how to kill people. No one ever survived a crucifixion. Theory 2. Jesus died all right, but when the women came to the tomb that morning, it was empty because the body had been stolen. This may sound possible until one asks, by whom? His disciples? They were scattered and terrified, and the tomb had been sealed and a guard placed at it. What's more, they thought it was all over. Despite Jesus' own predictions, they were not expecting a resurrection. Their belief system did not even allow for a resurrection of anyone until the end of the dead. But even if, despite all this, they had somehow done the theft, can we be expected to believe that they would then go out and spend their lives, and lose their lives as it happened, in defense of what they knew was a monstrous lie? So if not the disciples, who? The Jewish leaders and the Romans had every reason to keep that troublesome rabbi dead and buried, and they had even arranged for a guard on the tomb to make sure. No, stolen body theory won't wash. There was no one to carry out the theft. Theory 3. Simple confusion. When the women came to the tomb, they just visited the wrong one. The whole resurrection story was based on a mistake in directions. This is one of the silliest theories around, but one still hears it. After all, if this is what happened, then his body was still in its tomb, and the guards were still there. The authorities could very easily have produced the body at any time, and when the apostles began stirring up the people with stories of resurrection, they could have squashed the new faith in an hour. No, the women found the right tomb. Theory 4. The disciples saw something, but it was a vision or hallucination. Their keen desire to see Jesus again overcame their good sense, and the desire made them see what wasn't there at all. This has been a common theory in modern times, but it lacks even a scrap of evidence. All the evidence we possess says that what the witnesses claim they experienced was real. First, they were not expecting any return at all. As I've noted, the Jewish belief system did not allow for the dead to return to life until the end of time. When they heard the report that he was alive, they scoffed at it. When he really appeared, they shrank back in fear, thinking he was a ghost. He had to reassure them of his solidity by pointing out his wounds and by eating in their presence. And these things happened not once, but repeatedly with many different people. All the evidence we have from those who were there says this was the real Jesus back from the grave. Theory 5. Maybe the disciples just fabricated the whole story. Anyone can lie about anything, of course, and some people are good at it. But everything we know about human psychology says this couldn't happen. For a group of decent men and women, and the record makes it clear that they were, to be suddenly transformed from fear and despair to joy and boldness, and for them to defy threats and punishment from the authorities to continue preaching this message, and even to be martyred, as tradition says they all were eventually, all for a lie? Maybe you could find one person so twisted and self-destructive as to do something like this. But dozens of them? Hundreds of them? Not a chance. The trouble with all of these theories is that they are just that, notions spun out of sheer imagination, and they all require us to ignore the testimony of people who were there in favor of someone who wasn't there. Courts don't credit theories like these, and neither can we. To sum up, none of the attempted alternate explanations from the critics would be accepted in court. They all would be judged as parole evidence, verbal arguments intended to change the clear meaning of the documents. The documentary evidence, including the accounts of the eyewitnesses, prevails. And there is something that hasn't come up yet. It is significant that, despite the hostility of the Jewish and Roman leadership, no first-century document challenging the reality of the resurrection has ever appeared, nor is there evidence that any such was ever composed. There were many people who would have liked to crush this Christian message during those early years, and if they had had any knowledge to refute it, they surely would have brought it forth. But all they could do, as our records show, was bluster, threaten, and persecute. They had nothing else. We come at last, then, to the place where we began. You can test assertions in the physical world and prove or disprove them. Zinc dropped in acid either will or will not release hydrogen. We can test that. but you can't test the truth of a religious system. A given religion either appeals to you or it doesn't, and that is all subjective. Any one of them may make you feel fulfilled, or feel in tune with the infinite, or whatever. That is proof only to the one who has the feeling. What I hope we've seen here, though, is something unique among all the religions of the world. One message, the message of Jesus, offers a genuine, real-world historical test. Jesus based his claim to deity on his assertion that he would rise from the dead. It's a question of fact, not feeling, an event in time and space. Either it happened or it didn't. I believe we have seen here that by the rules of evidence that our culture uses to determine matters of fact, the evidence overwhelmingly proves the claim. The resurrection is a historical fact, and the Greeks have it right. Christos anesti, alethos anesti. He is risen indeed. And if the resurrection is a fact, then Jesus is who he claimed to be, the only true embodiment of the only true God. That leaves just one question. What will you do about it? If you have questions or comments about this lecture, or any others in the Good Answers series, you may direct them to me, Dr. Jerry C. Fore,